They say there are crosses that God never carved. And in the summer of 1835, 17 of them appeared, not on church doors, but on the blood-soaked wood of plantation bedrooms across Chatham County, North Carolina. Each one carved crudely by hand. Each one still wet when the dawn light hit it. 17 masters dead in 28 days. And not a single historian has ever connected the pattern. They called it a coincidence. But in the slave quarters they whispered another name, the preacher's prophecy. What followed that August wasn't a riot or a rebellion born of chaos. It was a ritual, a coordinated act of judgment led by a man who wore the mask of holy authority. A man who turned scripture into a sword. His name was Reverend Josiah Cumberland. And when he came to North Carolina that spring, he didn't come to save souls. He came to damn them. He walked barefoot between plantations, carrying only a Bible and a wooden cross he'd carved himself. His voice measured, thunderous, hypnotic, pierced through the air like judgment. He preached obedience to the masters during the day, but when night fell, in the candlelit dirt of slave quarters, he preached something else entirely. "Let my people go," he whispered. But then his voice darkened. What happens when Pharaoh refuses? That question echoed through the Carolina pines like a curse. Cumberland promised deliverance not through prayer, but through plagues. 7 plagues, he said, would fall on the land. The last would be blood on doorposts just as in Egypt, but this time, it would not belong to the innocent. In the hidden world of the enslaved, where songs carried messages and silence meant survival, his words spread like wildfire. Every field, every cabin, every hidden heart that had ever known cruelty began to hum with one idea: judgment was coming. But the most disturbing truth? Cumberland wasn't alone. Someone powerful funded his travels, forged his letters, and sent him to that county for a reason. He was the hand, but there was something far older guiding the knife. And when the first master died, they said his blood smelled of iron and salt, as if the land itself had been waiting for it. Josiah Cumberland arrived in Chatham County with nothing but faith in his eyes and vengeance in his heart. He called himself a servant of the Lord, but the sermons he carried were born in darker chambers. He wasn't just a preacher. He was a weapon shaped by hands that understood one thing: religion is the most efficient form of control. You see, the same year he began his circuit, private letters between plantation elites and the Raleigh clergy spoke of a spiritual remedy to calm the rising unrest among the enslaved. Preachers were being paid to pacify minds, to wrap chains not around wrists, but around beliefs. Cumberland had the perfect cover. His letters of introduction were forged by someone in Virginia, someone with access to church seals, someone who knew exactly how to infiltrate the South's holy infrastructure. But he went rogue. He took their method and reversed it. Instead of preaching submission, he preached inversion. Instead of salvation, he promised vengeance sanctified by Scripture. He gathered them at night, always in the quarters, always in whispers. No loud hymns, no open calls. Just his voice, threading through the dark like a serpent. The Lord works through human hands, and the time of waiting is over. Cumberland taught them that the cross was no longer a symbol of suffering, it was a weapon of remembrance. Each carved cross, he said, would mark not death, but balance. He made them believe that divine justice required blood. And yet, beneath his fire and fury, there was precision, a system. He divided the county into 7 districts. In each one, a leader, a slave he personally anointed, would receive instructions coded within hymns. Certain verses, sung on certain nights, carried messages. The sound of one song at the wrong hour could mean the difference between freedom and hanging. The first target was chosen not by rage, but by order. Judge William Petton, the county's overseer of law and morality. The man who held communion with one hand and the whip with the other. Cumberland called him Pharaoh of the county. When Petton's body was found, his door marked by the cross, the county was silent for days. But the preachers in nearby parishes didn't speak against it. Not one sermon condemned the act. And that silence, that was the real horror, because it meant someone higher was listening, proving, waiting to see how far the fire would spread. Understand this, Revolts are rarely spontaneous. They're born, cultivated, and often allowed. When power grows stagnant, sometimes it creates its own chaos just to reassert control. Cumberland may have thought he was serving God's vengeance. But in truth, he was fulfilling a prophecy written not in heaven, but in ledgers and sealed with blood. The night Judge Peton's body was found, the air in Chatham County turned heavy. Dogs refused to bark. The cotton fields lay silent, as though even the land was holding its breath. His throat had been cut clean surgical. No robbery, no panic. On the door behind him, the same mark again. A crooked cross cut deep enough to splinter the wood. The sheriff called it the work of demons. He wasn't wrong. By dawn, fear had moved faster than any rider could. But fear is a strange contagion. It infects both the oppressor and the oppressed. For the enslaved, it carried a different scent. Hope. Cumberland's prophecy had begun to feel real. And for those whose lives had known nothing but chains and lashes, divine justice no longer seemed like a myth. It was proof of presence. Proof that something greater was watching, finally answering their cries in blood. Yet the rebellion was not chaos. It was clockwork. Messages were passed in the rhythm of work songs, in the cadence of prayers, in the positioning of lanterns at night. A single candle in a window might mean, prepare. 2 candles, tonight. Each act was planned, precise, and eerily coordinated. The preacher had created not a mob but a movement. But here's what most never knew. While the fields burned and masters vanished, certain members of the county's white elite did nothing. No melisches. No coordinatid manhunt. They allowed the storm to run its course, because in secret they needed it. Letters uncovered decades later in the archives of Raleigh reveal discussions among state legislators cold, bureaucratic, and chillingly detached. They spoke of controlled purges, of letting fear drive tighter laws, and of converting slave insurrections into justifications for greater central control over counties and churches. The rebellion wasn't only a cry for freedom. It was a trial of power. While Cumberland preached vengeance from the bottom, other men in offices, men with titles preached fear from the top. Together, they created a perfect storm of control, the illusion of revolt feeding the machinery of authority. And in the middle of it stood one man, Cumberland, believing he was chosen, never realizing he was being used. There's a pattern here, one you'll see throughout history. Every system of control breeds its own enemy, then uses that enemy to justify itself. It's the same design you live under now, different uniforms, same architects. But you won't understand that yet. Not until you see how the fire truly spread. By the 3rd week of August, the air itself seemed alive, charged, trembling, as if the earth remembered what men tried to forget. That was when the fire sermons began. Cumberland no longer preached in secret. He stood openly at night beneath dead trees and broken barns, his voice cutting through the humid dark like the sound of judgment itself. His words, half scripture, half curse, drew both the enslaved and the fearful masters who dared to watch from the shadows. He spoke of Moses, but he also spoke of wrath, of a God who no longer waited, of a people who no longer begged. The Lord will pass through this land tonight, he cried, and he will not look for the innocent, he will look for the marked. When he raised his arms, flames leapt from torches behind him, painting his gaunt face in light and shadow. To the desperate, he looked like a prophet. To the guilty, he looked like something far worse, proof that their own sins had come back wearing God's name. In the following days, the pattern grew. 17 homes marked with crosses. 17 masters dead. Each one exactly 4 days apart. Each death at the same hour between midnight and 1. Some said they heard singing before the killings. Not the hymns of church pews, but the old songs, the kind whispered in the cotton rows, older than the Bible, older than English. Songs from before captivity. The kind of sound that makes the night tremble. Cumberland called it the cleansing. But behind that word lay something else, a private madness. Witnesses from the time described him as sleepless, muttering constantly, scratching verses into the dirt with his fingernails. 7 times 7, he whispered, over and over. Completion through destruction. Yet even as he spiraled, his followers grew more organized. Weapons were hidden beneath church floors, routes carved through swamps for retreat. The rebellion had become a living organism, half spirit, half strategy. But here's where the story fractures. Because 2 weeks later, when the militias finally moved in, they didn't arrest Cumberland. They escorted him out of the county under armed guard. Not as a prisoner, as a protected asset. And that's when the truth began to reek. Not one man was charged for the murders of the 17 masters. The case was buried under insufficient evidence. The preacher vanished north, his name erased from church records. But months later, reports appeared of a man matching his description preaching in Virginia, this time to white congregations. Now ask yourself, who sends a man to light a fire and then hides him before the smoke clears? Someone needed the blood. Someone profited from the chaos. And you were never supposed to find out who. If you're still watching, comment, "I bear the mark" twice to lock this truth inside you. That's how we know you've seen behind the curtain. The fires were put out. The crosses were washed away. But the system, the one that birthed both the whip and the preacher, never ended. It only evolved. They called it reconstruction. They called it order restored. But beneath those words was a hidden architecture, a reprogramming of faith itself. When Reverend Cumberland disappeared, the pulpits didn't fall silent. They were filled by men just like him. Dozens of preachers, trained by the same hand that forged his letters, spread across the South under government funding and missionary boards. They preached submission in new words, freedom through faith, peace through patience, obedience through order. But the sermons weren't meant for the enslaved anymore. They were for everyone. See, after every revolt, there comes a reckoning, not for justice, but for control. The same families who lost power in the rebellion rebuilt it through churches, schools, and newspapers. They learned something vital. You don't have to chain a man's body if you can chain his perception of truth. So they rewrote the narrative. The slave revolt of 1835 became a whispered ghost story told in plantation parlors, stripped of meaning, twisted into a warning. See what happens when you give them too much hope? And the preacher? He became a myth, a cautionary tale. But behind closed doors, his words were studied, dissected, and repurposed. The elite discovered something terrifyingly effective. Faith can be reverse-engineered. By 1850, pamphlets circulated across North Carolina teaching plantation ministers how to preserve order through moral structure. It was control disguised as salvation. The same pattern you still see today in politics, media, movements that claim liberation but serve hierarchy. Every time a system trembles, a new Cumberland appears speaking of justice, promising redemption, but always underwritten by those who benefit from the cycle. The cleansing never ended because the fire was never about freedom. It was about resetting the board. Every era needs its scapegoat. Every system needs its prophet. And while the world watched 17 crosses burn into history, the true masters, those untouched by flame or accusation, rewrote the covenant of control. You think this ended in 1835? Look closer. The language of obedience, the guilt wrapped in scripture, the illusion of choice, you live inside its perfected form. Cumberland was not a man. He was a prototype, and the system that built him learned to hide better. Cumberland vanished, but the pattern he embodied did not. Every age finds its own preacher, its own voice that bends the sacred into a mirror for control. Not always with chains, not always with fire, sometimes with promises. The prototype was simple. Take a man's hunger for meaning, feed it with fear, wrap it in revelation, and you can guide him anywhere. Across centuries, that mechanism repeated itself. Kings, generals, politicians, ideologues all discovered the same formula Cumberland stumbled upon in blood and faith. The secret isn't domination, it's devotion. People will fight their oppressors, but they will die for their symbols. Think of how easily loyalty can be scripted. A flag, a creed, a cause, a leader. All it takes is the right tone, the right rhythm, the right enemy. Every empire learns that rhythm. Every system needs its hymn. Cumberland's sermons were crude, but they birthed something timeless, the understanding that truth, once wrapped in emotion, becomes immune to reason. The master of minds does not silence doubt. He drowns it in belonging. And here is the warning buried inside the myth. When you hear a voice that makes you feel chosen, ask yourself who benefits from your conviction, because power no longer wears robes or crowns. It speaks through algorithms, through the need to be seen, through the echo of your own beliefs reflected back at you. The pulpit has become a screen, the sermon a feed, but the pattern, the prototype, remains unchanged. Faith, fear, and belonging engineered into obedience. The only rebellion left is awareness. To look at the voice that moves you and ask, whose script am I reading? Every empire that ever rose began with a single man looking into a mirror and seeing something he could not control himself. The hunger, the fear, the need to be seen as powerful. Those are the first tyrants any of us meet. Cumberland's sermons were never just about rebellion. They were about reflection. Every time he spoke of masters and slaves, of angels and judgment, he was speaking to both sides at once. Because inside every man lives a master and a slave. One commands, the other obeys. The master demands certainty. The slave hungers for direction. And between them stands conscience, often silenced, often afraid. Look close enough and you start to see how easily those inner roles can be manipulated. Give the master a creed, and he'll call it destiny. Give the slave a mission, and he'll call it faith. Either way, both serve the same unseen will, the will to avoid facing themselves. That's how control survives. Not through chains, but through roles you never question. Every time you repeat a phrase because it feels righteous, every time you follow an idea because it promises belonging, you're enact the same ceremony Cumberland began. The words change, the uniforms change, the rituals adapt, but the architecture remains. Control, obedience, justification. But it doesn't have to. The mirror can become a weapon of clarity instead of domination. If you stare long enough, if you dare to look without the filters of creed or fear, you begin to see the strings. You realize that every force that ever ruled you was borrowing your own energy. That's the paradox of dominion. The more you search for power over others, the less power you have over yourself. And the moment you turn inward, not to worship, not to condemn, but to witness, the system begins to lose its grip. Because awareness breaks hierarchy. When you know your own shadow, no preacher, no master, no ideology can use it against you. The only true revolution begins in the quiet act of seeing. That's where the story always leads, not to fire or thrones, but to a mirror, and the question that burns through every age. Who is really commanding me? They say the 17th cross was never found, that the last door was marked, but no body lay behind it. Just an empty room, the window open, curtains stirring in a wind that smelled of rain and iron. Some believed Cumberland carved it for himself. Others said the final mark wasn't meant for a man at all, but for the system that created him, the empire of obedience and fear he had once served. Whether that's true or not doesn't matter. What matters is what the cross meant. Each of the 17 marks, cut in trembling wood, wasn't only a warning, it was a mirror. A reflection of everything that happens when belief becomes a weapon, when conviction replaces thought, when a man lets another write his purpose for him. The 17th cross is the one that waits for everyone who sees through the story. It is the moment you realize that judgment and freedom have always been the same blade, turned different ways. Cumberland's fire burned out, but the pattern didn't die. It passed through pulpits and newspapers, through slogans and screens, reshaping itself each time. The form of control changed. The core remained. But there's something the old preachers never understood. When you look directly at the machinery of power, not to worship, not to fear, but simply to see it, it starts to dissolve. Because power survives only in darkness. Awareness is its undoing. Maybe that's why the last cross was left blank, an open space where you decide what it means. Not an ending, but an invitation. To see the cage and refuse to decorate it. To walk into the world without needing to be ruled or redeemed. So if you've listened this far, if you've carried these words past the edge of comfort, remember, the last cross isn't carved in blood or wood. It's drawn the moment you choose awareness over obedience. The preacher's prophecy was never about destruction. It was about awakening the kind that cannot be controlled. And once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. The 17th cross is yours now. The 17th cross is yours now. Subscribe and keep descending with us through the buried chapters of history.